The scent of old paper and leather was Elijah Grant's sanctuary. It was the smell of history, of stories waiting to be told, of quiet truths bound in cloth and thread. Here, inside the hushed halls of the Bull Street Library in Savannah, Georgia, the world made sense. The air, thick with the city's trademark humidity and the sweet perfume of jasmine drifting through an open window, was a balm to his soul. He was a man made of quiet corners and forgotten lore, a cartographer of fictional worlds and a guardian of printed words. At 42, his life was a study in gentle routine. The precise shelving of books, the soft-spoken guidance offered to a student researching the Gulagi-Che corridor, the patient untangling of a microfilm machine for an elderly genealogist. His hands, though soft, were knowing. They could find a misplaced folio in the dark or soothe the spine of a brittle, centuries-old map. This life of quiet dignity, however, was a source of profound and ever-growing irritation for his wife, Denise. Tonight, the quiet of their shared Victorian home in the Ardsley Park district felt different. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was a tense, waiting silence. The grandfather clock in the foyer, a wedding gift from her parents, seemed to tick with an accusatory rhythm. Elijah sat at his small, antique writing desk in the study, the polished mahogany cool beneath his forearms. The room was his only true territory in the house, a space crowded with overflowing bookshelves and stacks of research tomes. Outside, a late spring rain whispered against the large bay window, the droplets tracing silver paths through the dust on the glass. He wasn't cataloging acquisitions for the library. He was worlds away, in a land of shimmering cities and winged beasts, his fingers flying across the keyboard of his unassuming laptop. Under the pen name Silas Thorne, Elijah was not just a librarian. He was a god, a creator of empires, a weaver of epic sagas that had captured the imagination of millions around the globe. No one knew, not his colleagues, not his friends, and certainly not his wife. It was a secret he kept folded away, as precious and fragile as the rarest manuscript in the library's special collections. The sound of a key in the front door lock shattered his concentration. 11:47 p.m. He glanced at the clock. She was late again. He closed the laptop, the glowing world of Ethelgard vanishing in an instant. He rose and went to the doorway of the study, leaning against the frame, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Denise swept in, a gust of expensive perfume and the damp chill of the night air. She was a vision in a silk blouse the color of champagne and a pencil skirt that hugged her curves. Her hair, professionally straightened and glossed, was perfect despite the rain. She worked in marketing for a major hotel chain, a job that required her to be polished, sharp, and perpetually networking. She looked, as always, like she had just stepped from the pages of a magazine that Elijah would never read. "Don't you ever sleep?" she asked, her voice clipped. She didn't look at him, her attention focused on dropping her designer handbag onto the polished credenza. A faint, unfamiliar scent clung to her. A man's cologne, something sharp and citrusy, utterly unlike Elijah's own subtle, bookish scent of sandalwood and paper. It was the scent of Derek Vance, the charismatic silver-haired anchor for Savannah's top news station. Elijah knew this because he'd smelled it on her twice before in the last month. "I was just finishing up some work," Elijah said, his voice soft, easily absorbed by the cavernous hallway. "Work," she scoffed, finally turning to face him. Her eyes, usually a warm, deep brown, were hard as agate. "You mean your little hobby, dusting off old books and telling people to be quiet. Did you at least remember to take out the recycling? The bins were still on the curb when I pulled in." "I was about to," he murmured, the familiar sting of her condescension prickling his skin. It hadn't always been this way. He remembered a time, years ago, when she'd been fascinated by his mind. She would listen for hours as he spun tales of Savannah's hidden history, of the pirates and ghosts that lingered in the moss-draped squares. She'd called him her storyteller. Now, his stories were an embarrassment, his profession a social liability. "Of course you were," she said, pulling off her trench coat. "Always about to. Elijah, we need to talk." He knew this tone. It was the preamble to a lecture, a carefully constructed monologue about his lack of ambition, their stagnant social standing, the superiority of her friend's husband, who had just been made partner at his law firm. He braced himself. I went to the club with the Hendersons tonight, she began, walking into the living room and switching on a lamp that cast sharp, unforgiving shadows. Carlton was there. Carlton Briggs was Henderson's partner, a notoriously flashy attorney known for his expensive suits and his ruthless courtroom tactics. Denise was enamored with him. He was talking about his new boat, a 60-foot yacht. He's taking it to the Keys for a month. Meanwhile, our big summer trip is driving to Helen, Georgia, to look at cuckoo clocks. I thought you liked Helen, Elijah said quietly. I liked it when I was 25 and we had nothing, she snapped, whirling around. I'm 40, Elijah. I don't want to have nothing anymore. I want a life, a real life, not this quiet, dusty, mediocre existence. Each word was a carefully aimed dart. He felt them land, one by one. He stood, silent, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn corduroy trousers. Silence was his defense, a wall he built brick by brick against her verbal assaults. It infuriated her more than any argument could. Is that all you have to say? Nothing? She demanded, her voice rising. God, you are so passive. Do you even care that our life is going nowhere? That I am suffocating in this house, in this marriage? What do you want me to say, Denise? He asked, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. That I should quit the job I love? That I should become someone I'm not, just to keep up with Carlton Briggs? Yes, she cried, throwing her hands up in exasperation. Maybe you should. Maybe you should want more than your pathetic little salary. Maybe you should think about me for once, about my needs. Her eyes glistened, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. I have needs, Elijah, needs you can't even begin to understand, let alone fulfill. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the summer humidity. The citrusy cologne, the late nights, the constant buzzing phone she always kept angled away from him. It all coalesced into a painful, undeniable truth. He had suspected it for months, but had pushed the thought away, burying it under layers of denial and hope. Hope that this was a phase, that the woman he had married was still in there somewhere. I can't do this anymore, she said, her voice dropping to a cold, decisive whisper. She walked back to the credenza and picked up her handbag. From it, she pulled a thick manila envelope and slapped it onto the polished wood surface. The sound echoed in the silent house. I've filed for divorce. Elijah stared at the envelope. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Grant versus Grant. His world, which had felt so solid just moments before, fractured. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. I want you out, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. I want you out by the end of the week. This is my house. My parents helped with the down payment. You and your books can find somewhere else to collect dust. He looked from the envelope to her face. He was searching for a flicker of the woman he once loved, a hint of regret, of shared history. He found nothing. Her expression was one of cool, calculated finality. She had been planning this for a long time. The lawyer, the paperwork, the speech, it was all rehearsed. My lawyer is Carlton Briggs, she added, as if delivering the killing blow. He said it should be a simple, straightforward process. You have nothing, so there's nothing to fight over. He'll be in touch. With that, she turned and walked up the grand staircase, her heels clicking a sharp, dismissive rhythm on the hardwood steps. Elijah was left alone in the hallway, the accusatory ticking of the clock now sounding like a countdown. He walked slowly to the credenza and picked up the envelope. It felt heavy, impossibly heavy, filled with the weight of 15 years of marriage, now reduced to legal jargon and demands. He opened it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, the documents were cold and impersonal. Petition for dissolution of marriage, spousal support request, division of assets. She was demanding everything, the house, the car, and alimony based on her accustomed standard of living, which she claimed his meager salary could not support. He sank into a nearby armchair, the papers rustling in his lap. The rain outside intensified, lashing against the windows. He thought of Ethelgard, the world he had built from scratch, a world of honor and courage, of magic and consequence. In that world, betrayal was a grave sin, punished by the gods. In this world, it was just Tuesday. A deep, hollow ache spread through his chest. It wasn't just the loss of his marriage, but the brutal, stunning cruelty of its end. She hadn't just left him. She had tried to erase him, to define him by his perceived failures, to render him worthless. You have nothing, so there's nothing to fight over. The words echoed in his mind, a venomous whisper. He closed his eyes, the smell of old paper from his study, a distant, comforting memory. She was wrong. He didn't have nothing. He had a secret worth a kingdom. And in the quiet, rain-lashed house, a new story began to take shape in his mind. A story of a quiet king, long underestimated, who was about to reveal the true extent of his power. The next 3 days were a blur of painful logistics. Elijah packed his life into cardboard boxes, a somber archaeology of a shared past. Each object held a memory, now tainted. The worn armchair where he read to her in their first year of marriage, the collection of sea glass they had gathered on Tybee Island, the framed photo from their wedding day, 2 smiling strangers he no longer recognized. Denise moved around him with an air of detached impatience, as if he were a piece of furniture being slowly removed. She made calls, her voice bright and cheerful, discussing brunch plans and gallery openings. Derek Vance's name was mentioned more than once. Elijah worked in silence, the weight of her disregard a physical presence in every room. He found a small, furnished apartment for rent, above a dusty, beloved independent bookstore near Forsyth Park. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the Ardsley Park house. The floors creaked, the plumbing groaned, and the windows looked out onto a lane shaded by the sprawling limbs of a magnificent live oak. It was perfect. The air smelled of roasted coffee from the cafe downstairs and faintly of the books below. It smelled like home. His landlord, a kind elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, who had known Elijah for years from the library, gave him the keys with a sympathetic look and a quiet, "You let me know if you need anything, son." On his last trip out of the house, carrying a heavy box labeled Research, Denise stood in the doorway, arms crossed, tapping her foot. She was dressed to go out, wearing a vibrant red dress that screamed confidence. "Is that everything?" she asked, her tone suggesting he was taking far too long. "Almost," he said, not looking at her. "Good. Make sure you leave your key on the counter." She glanced at the box in his arms. "Still clinging to those dusty old books, I see. Some things never change." He stopped and finally met her gaze. He saw the pity in her eyes, the smug certainty of her superiority. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The grief that had been a suffocating fog began to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. "You're right, Denise," he said, his voice even. "Some things never change, and some things are not at all what they seem." He walked past her without another word, loaded the last box into his modest sedan, and drove away from the life he had known, the rearview mirror reflecting the perfect facade of the house where he had become a stranger. He spent the weekend unpacking, not just his clothes and books, but the pieces of himself. He arranged his research tomes on the built-in shelving, the familiar spines a comforting presence. He set up his laptop on a small wooden table by the window, the view of the oak's mossy branches a welcome change from the manicured lawn of his former home. He felt a strange sense of liberation. The constant pressure to be someone else, to want different things, was gone. Here, in this small, book-scented apartment, he could simply be Elijah Grant. On Monday morning, he received the first official email from Carlton Briggs. It was a masterpiece of condescending legal intimidation. "Mr. Grant, be advised that I am representing your wife, Denise Grant, in the matter of your divorce. Given your limited financial resources and negligible contributions to the marital estate, we are prepared to offer a swift and final settlement. My client will retain the marital home and all its contents. She will also retain the vehicle. In exchange for your full cooperation, she will graciously waive her right to pursue you for alimony, a claim she would most certainly win, given the significant disparity in your respective career trajectories. We expect your signed acceptance of these terms within 48 hours. Any attempt to contest this will result in protracted and costly litigation that you are ill-equipped to handle. Regards, Carlton Briggs, Esquire." Elijah read the email 3 times. Negligible contributions. Ill-equipped to handle. Briggs had the same dismissive tone as Denise, but sharpened to a legal point. He forwarded the email to a name he'd found through a quiet inquiry with his literary agent in New York. Ari, his agent, had been furious when Elijah told him a sanitized version of events. This guy sounds like a peacock, Eli. You need a lion. I know someone. The lion was a woman named Eleanor Gable. She wasn't a flashy downtown lawyer. Her office was in a restored historic building in the city's Victorian district, filled with antique furniture, thriving ferns, and the scent of lemon polish. Mrs. Gable was in her late 60s with intelligent, kind eyes, silver hair pulled back in an elegant twist, and a presence that was both calming and formidable. She was known throughout Savannah for her sharp mind and her unwavering integrity. She had read Carlton's email before Elijah arrived. "Mr. Briggs enjoys the sound of his own voice, doesn't he?" she said, her tone dry as she peered at him over her reading glasses. "He's a bully, Mr. Grant, and bullies only have power if you're afraid of them. Are you afraid?" "I was," Elijah admitted. "Now, I'm just tired of being underestimated." "Good," she nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's a much better place to start. Now, tell me everything, and I mean everything. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." For the next 2 hours, Elijah talked. He told her about his 15-year marriage, about Denise's growing discontent, her obsession with status, the subtle and overt humiliations. He told her about his job at the library, the modest salary, the simple life he loved. And then he took a deep breath and told her his secret. He told her about Silas Thorne. He explained the pen name, the genre, the surprise success of his first book, and the explosive worldwide phenomenon the series, The Sunstone Chronicles, had become. He told her about the foreign rights sales, the merchandise, the audio books, and the 8-figure movie deal that had just been finalized with a major Hollywood studio. Mrs. Gable listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt, she just let him speak, her fingers steepled under her chin. When he was finished, the room was silent, save for the gentle hum of an old ceiling fan. Elijah felt exposed, vulnerable. Finally, Mrs. Gable spoke. "May I see some documentation?" she asked, her voice calm. Elijah reached into his worn leather satchel, the same one Denise had often called his pathetic professor bag, and pulled out a thick folder. He hadn't just brought pay stubs. He had logged into the publisher's secure online portal that morning and printed out the last 3 years of royalty statements. He had printed the contracts, the wire transfer confirmations for his advances, and the summary page from the film rights sale. He pushed the folder across the polished desk. Mrs. Gable opened it. She put on her glasses and began to read. Elijah watched as her eyebrows rose, just slightly. She turned a page, and then another. Her calm demeanor didn't change, but he saw a new light in her eyes, a glint of steel. She spent a full 10 minutes silently reviewing the documents, her sharp legal mind absorbing every detail, every number, every contractual clause. When she was done, she closed the folder and looked at Elijah. The look was no longer just kind. It was deeply, profoundly respectful. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice imbued with a new gravity. "Your wife and her peacock of a lawyer have made a catastrophic miscalculation." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "They believe they're fighting a field mouse. They are about to discover they've picked a fight with a dragon." A plan was formed. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. They would not respond to Carlton Briggs's email. They would not engage with his threats. They would comply with the standard financial disclosure requirements, but they would do so in their own time, in their own way. Mrs. Gable explained that in a divorce, all marital assets must be disclosed. His literary earnings, accumulated during the marriage, were a marital asset. Denise was technically entitled to a portion of them. "She will be," Mrs. Gable said, a shrewd look on her face. "But the law also takes into account behavior, adultery, dissipation of marital assets. Mr. Briggs is about to find his case has become far more complicated. We will let them walk into that courtroom believing they hold all the cards. We will let them play their hand. And then," she smiled, a genuine, formidable smile, "we will show them ours." The following weeks were a strange purgatory. Elijah went to work at the library, the familiar routines, a comforting anchor in the storm of his life. He helped patrons, shelved books, and in his quiet moments he wrote. The turmoil of his personal life fueled his creative fire. The antagonist in his new book became crueler, more cunning. The hero became more resilient, his inner strength forged in the fires of betrayal. He saw Denise once, from a distance. She was laughing with a group of friends on the patio of a trendy restaurant, a glass of champagne in her hand. Derek Vance was at the next table, pretending not to know her, but Elijah saw the quick shared glance between them. It was a small, exclusive world, and Denise was finally at its center. The sight no longer caused him pain. It was like watching a scene from a play for which he no longer had a ticket. Carlton Briggs, meanwhile, grew more agitated. He sent a flurry of increasingly aggressive emails and letters, each one more condescending than the last. He filed motions to compel, accusing Elijah of hiding assets, a laughable accusation, given their assumptions. He clearly believed Elijah was trying to hide a few $1,000s in a savings account, not a literary empire. "Mr. Grant is stonewalling," he wrote in one motion. His refusal to comply is indicative of a man with something to hide, though one struggles to imagine what that could possibly be, given his station in life. Mrs. Gable handled it all with unflappable grace. "Let him tire himself out," she advised Elijah over the phone. "He's putting on a show for his client. The louder the bark, the smaller the dog." Finally, the day of the preliminary hearing arrived. It was a sweltering mid-July morning in Savannah. The air was so heavy you could drink it. Elijah walked to the Chatham County Courthouse, the humidity settling on his skin like a damp shroud. He wore a simple dark gray suit he'd owned for years. It was well made, but unremarkable. He carried his old leather satchel. He felt a strange sense of calm. The story had been written. All that was left was to read it aloud. He met Mrs. Gable in the lobby. She gave him a reassuring nod. "Deep breaths, Mr. Grant. Remember, we are in the right. The truth is a powerful ally." They entered the courtroom. It was a cold, impersonal space with cheap wood paneling and harsh fluorescent lighting. Denise was already there, sitting beside Carlton Briggs at the plaintiff's table. She looked magnificent. She wore a pristine white power suit, her hair and makeup flawless. She looked like a woman who had already won. When she saw Elijah, she gave him a look of pure, unadulterated pity, then turned to whisper something in Carlton's ear. They both shared a small, cruel smirk. Carlton Briggs was everything Elijah had expected. His suit was Italian silk, his watch was a gold monstrosity, and his hair was slicked back with a product that probably cost more than Elijah's weekly grocery bill. He oozed a smug, predatory confidence. He sized Elijah up with a dismissive glance, his eyes lingering on the worn satchel. They all rose as the judge entered. Judge Patricia Alston was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, with a reputation for being sharp, fair, and having very little patience for theatrics. She surveyed the room over her glasses, her expression stern. "Be seated." The proceedings began. Carlton Briggs rose to his feet, his voice booming in the quiet room. "Your Honor, we are here today because my client, Mrs. Denise Grant, has been forced to end her marriage to a man who, for 15 years, has refused to contribute meaningfully to their shared life. A man content with mediocrity, who is happy to let his ambitious, hard-working wife carry the financial and emotional burden of their household." He paced before the judge, a well-rehearsed performance. "Denise Grant is a rising star in the hospitality industry. Elijah Grant," he said the name with a sneer, "is a municipal librarian." He let the title hang in the air, as if it were an accusation. "A noble profession, to be sure, but not one that builds a future, not one that could provide the life my client deserves." Elijah sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his satchel in his lap. He kept his eyes on the judge, his expression neutral. He could feel Denise's triumphant gaze on him, but he refused to look at her. Briggs continued his monologue, painting a picture of Denise as a long-suffering saint, and Elijah as a passionless, unambitious freeloader. He used words like stagnant, uninspired, and financial dead weight. Mrs. Gable sat beside Elijah, making quiet notes on a legal pad, her face a mask of calm professionalism. Finally, Briggs moved to the topic of finances. "Your Honor, this should be simple. The marital assets are few. The primary asset is the home, which was secured with significant help from my client's family. Mr. Grant's income is, to put it charitably, modest. We have his pay stubs right here." He strutted over to the clerk and handed over a thin file with a dramatic flourish. "As you can see, Mr. Grant's annual salary from the city is $52,416, before taxes." He turned to look directly at Elijah, a smirk playing on his lips. It is my client's contention that Mr. Grant has been deliberately hiding his financial information, though, for the life of us, we can't imagine what pittance he could possibly be trying to conceal. Several people in the small gallery, friends of Denise's no doubt, tittered with laughter. Denise herself looked down at her perfectly manicured nails, a small, satisfied smile on her face. The humiliation was thick in the air, a palpable thing. Judge Alston looked at the documents, her face impassive. She then turned her gaze to Mrs. Gable. "Ms. Gable, does your client have anything to add to this financial disclosure?" Mrs. Gable rose slowly, her movements deliberate and dignified. "Yes, Your Honor. My client does have an additional source of income to declare. We have provided the relevant documentation." She walked to the clerk and handed over a thick bound portfolio. It was far more substantial than Carlton's thin file. The clerk handed it up to the judge. Carlton Briggs looked momentarily confused. Then his smirk returned. "Your Honor, I'm sure Mr. Grant's weekend earnings from a book-mending hobby are very quaint, but I fail to see their relevance." Judge Alston ignored him. She opened the portfolio. Elijah watched her face closely. He saw her eyes scan the first page, a cover letter from Mrs. Gable. Then she turned the page. Her impassive expression flickered. A slight frown creased her brow. She took off her glasses, polished them with a cloth from her robes, and put them back on, leaning closer to the document. She turned another page, and then another. The silence in the courtroom stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Denise's smug smile began to falter. She shot a questioning look at Carlton, who just shrugged, his own confidence beginning to look a little strained. Judge Alston looked up from the portfolio, her sharp gaze now fixed on Elijah. There was no pity in her eyes now. There was something else, astonishment. "Mr. Grant," the judge said, her voice holding a new note of respect. "Are you, or have you ever been, professionally known by the name Silas Thorne?" The name dropped into the silent courtroom, like a stone into a still pond. Denise's head snapped up. Her eyes widened. She knew that name. She'd seen the books on bestseller lists, heard people buzzing about the upcoming movie. She'd even complained once that Elijah should read something popular for a change, like that Silas Thorne guy. Elijah met the judge's gaze. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." A collective gasp went through the gallery. Carlton Briggs's jaw literally dropped. He stared at Elijah, his face a mask of disbelief. Denise went pale, the color draining from her face until she was the same shade as her white suit. "Ms. Gable," the judge said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "This portfolio contains royalty statements from Pendragon Publishing House, contracts for foreign translation rights, and a finalized agreement for film rights with a major motion picture studio." She paused, looking directly at a now gaping Carlton Briggs. "Mr. Briggs, you stated that your client's husband earns $52,000 a year." She picked up a summary sheet from the top of the portfolio. According to this verified and notarized statement, Mr. Grant's, or rather Mr. Thorne's, net income for the last fiscal year, after agent commissions and business expenses, was $18,432,567.14. The number echoed in the dead silent room. $18 million. Denise made a small, choking sound. She stared at Elijah, her mouth agape. It was as if she was seeing him for the first time. The quiet, unassuming librarian she had mocked and discarded was a complete stranger, a stranger who held a kingdom in his hands. The man she had called a failure, a financial deadweight, was one of the most successful authors in the world. Carlton Briggs was sputtering, his face turning a blotchy red. Your Honor, this is preposterous. It's some kind of trick, a forgery." Judge Alston fixed him with an icy glare. "Counselor, are you accusing a respected officer of the court, Ms. Gable, of submitting fraudulent documents in my courtroom? These are certified financial records. I suggest you choose your next words very, very carefully." Briggs snapped his mouth shut. The fight had gone out of him completely. He looked deflated, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The judge turned her attention back to the documents. "I see here a significant advance was just paid for Mr. Grant's next 3 novels. And the film deal, my goodness." She looked up, her gaze sweeping over Denise, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure, horrified greed. The realization of what she had thrown away was dawning on her in the most brutal, public way imaginable. "Your Honor," Mrs. Gable said, her voice calm and clear, "given this new information, we would like to formally retract our initial passive stance on the division of assets. Furthermore, we will be filing a counterclaim, citing adultery and emotional distress. We have evidence that Mrs. Grant has been engaged in a long-term affair and has been dissipating marital assets to support a lifestyle with her paramour." She placed a slim file on her desk. "We have receipts, hotel bills, jewelry purchases, all paid from a joint account." Denise looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her eyes darted from the judge to her lawyer to Elijah. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The foundation of her world, her carefully constructed reality of superiority, had been demolished in less than 5 minutes. Judge Alston's face was grim. She looked at Denise with undisguised contempt. "Mrs. Grant, your petition for spousal support is denied, with prejudice. In fact, given this staggering disparity in assets, which your husband seems to have earned entirely through his own efforts while you were, shall we say, otherwise occupied, you may find yourself in the novel position of being the one to pay." The judge slammed her gavel down. "This hearing is adjourned. I'll see counsel in my chambers in 10 minutes to discuss a new discovery schedule. And Mr. Briggs," she added, her voice dripping with ice, "I'd advise you to come prepared this time." The aftermath was a blur of silent, slow-motion chaos. As the judge swept from the room, a stunned silence gave way to frantic whispering. Carlton Briggs, utterly defeated, slumped into his chair, avoiding the furious, panicked glare of his client. Denise was frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the ugly contortions of shock and avarice warring on her face. She kept looking at Elijah, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading confusion. It was a look that said, "How could you do this to me?" But what it really meant was, "How could you have this without me?" Elijah felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, no desire to gloat. He just felt quiet. He gathered his things, sliding his satchel over his shoulder. "Mrs." Gable gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "You were magnificent, Mr. Grant." "I didn't do anything," he whispered. "You were yourself," she corrected him gently. "In the face of all that ugliness, you were yourself. That is more than enough." As he turned to leave, Denise finally found her voice. "Elijah!" she called out, a raw, desperate sound. He stopped but didn't turn around. He could feel the entire room's attention on them. "Elijah, we need to talk. We can fix this." He finally turned, his gaze calm and steady. He looked at the woman who had shared his bed for 15 years, the woman who had thrown him out with less ceremony than she would the recycling. He saw not a partner, but a stranger whose calculations had gone horribly wrong. "There's nothing to fix, Denise," he said, his voice soft, but carrying the finality of a closing chapter. "You were right. I have nothing you want." He walked out of the courtroom, leaving her standing amidst the wreckage of her own making. The humid Savannah air felt different as he stepped outside. It felt lighter, cleaner. The weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying for years had been lifted. He didn't take a taxi. He walked through the historic squares, under the canopy of ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, the city's timeless beauty a soothing balm. He was just Elijah Grant, a man who loved books, walking home. The only difference was that now, home was entirely his own. The story broke faster than he could have imagined. A local reporter in the courtroom had connected the dots between the quiet librarian and the literary titan. By the time he reached his apartment, his phone was buzzing incessantly with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. The headline on the Savannah Morning News website was stark. "Local librarian revealed as global best-selling author Silas Thorne in dramatic divorce hearing." The story went viral. It was a perfect tale for the digital age: the underestimated husband, the greedy wife, the stunning courtroom reversal. It was a story of karmic justice, and the world devoured it. His agent Ari called, ecstatic. "Eli, you're a legend. The movie studio is going nuts. They want to move up the production schedule. My phone has been ringing off the hook." Elijah let it all wash over him. He made a pot of strong chicory coffee and sat by his window, watching the world go by. He saw the news vans camped outside his old house in Ardsley Park. He saw a brief, shaky video clip of Denise, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, rushing to her car, hounded by reporters. He even saw a clip of Derek Vance, looking flustered and angry, as a journalist ambushed him outside the TV station, asking for his comment on his relationship with the now infamous Denise Grant. Derek's terse no comment spoke volumes. Her carefully curated world was not just crumbling, it was being publicly dismantled. The divorce was settled quickly and quietly after that. Carlton Briggs, thoroughly humbled, was taken off the case. Denise's new lawyer was far more reasonable. Elijah was extraordinarily generous. He didn't want a fight, he wanted closure. He gave her a settlement that would ensure she could live comfortably. But it was a pittance compared to what she had dreamed of, and a fraction of what she might have been entitled to had she not been so cruel, so dismissive, so blind. He kept his empire. She was left with a sum of money that felt more like a severance package than a share of a life. A final, quiet statement on what their marriage had become. A failed transaction. Months passed. The media frenzy died down. The world moved on. Elijah's life, however, had been irrevocably transformed. He bought a magnificent historic home south of Forsyth Park, a grand old dame of a house with a wraparound porch, a garden filled with camellias, and a library with 20-foot ceilings and rolling ladders. He resigned from his position at the Bull Street Library but didn't leave it behind. He established the Thorne Foundation for Literacy, a non-profit dedicated to funding and modernizing Savannah's public libraries and creating reading programs for underprivileged children. He would often volunteer, not as a benefactor, but as Elijah, the librarian, helping a young girl find a book about dragons, his heart full. He saw Denise one last time, about a year later. He was in a small, independent grocery store, picking out peaches. He saw her in the wine aisle. She looked smaller, diminished. The designer clothes were still there, but they hung on her differently. The fire, the sharp ambition in her eyes, had been replaced by a kind of dull, weary resentment. She was no longer with Derek Vance. The scandal had been too much for his public image. Her social circle had ostracized her, embarrassed by her blatant, failed avarice. She saw him and froze, a bottle of Chardonnay halfway into her cart. For a moment, their eyes met across the aisle. He saw a flicker of shame, of loss, of 1,000 unspoken regrets. He gave her a small, polite nod, a gesture not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, of closure. Then he turned and continued with his shopping. That evening, Elijah sat on his sprawling porch in an old rocking chair, a glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand. The setting sun cast a golden light through the Spanish moss, making it look like spun gold. The air was filled with the sound of cicadas, Savannah's eternal summer song. His new life was quiet, but it was a peace-filled quiet, not a tense one. It was a life of his own design, built not on the validation of others, but on the sturdy foundation of his own worth. A blank notebook and a fountain pen lay on the small table beside him. A new world was waiting. He was ready to begin. True wealth is never loud. It isn't found in the gleam of a new car or the square footage of a house. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own value, a treasure that no one can ever take from you, no matter how hard they try to convince you that you are worthless. What would you do if someone laughed at your dreams? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Amara Folktales for more powerful stories every week. Thank you for watching.